In this lecture, we're really going to begin discussing cardiac physiology, okay? Basically heart physiology. The first thing to recognize is the heart is made up of what are called cardiac muscle fibers. Okay? The whole heart is mostly made up of muscle fibers. Like if you were to look at a skeletal muscle, like the biceps muscle, it's mostly made up of skeletal muscle fibers. If you look at the heart is mostly made up of cardiac muscle fibers. Okay, it's, I think, a fair comparison. What we want to do initially here is differentiate somewhat between skeletal muscle fibers and cardiac muscle fibers, and then continue to go into more and more detail as we progress. So let's start on a real basic level. Over here on the left, there are three skeletal muscle fibers. These three skeletal muscle fibers could exist in the biceps muscle, for example. And then you're seeing in alpha motor neuron synapsing with these three skeletal muscle fibers. All right. So let's say that you want these three skeletal muscle fibers to generate 70 twitches over the course of 1 minute. How are you going to get these three skeletal muscle fibers to generate 70 twitches over the course of 1 minute? You need the alpha motor neuron to generate and pass 70 action potentials to these three skeletal muscle fibers over the course of 1 minute, because each action potential that's passed to a skeletal muscle fiber is going to translate into that skeletal muscle fiber generating a twitch. Right? So if you want these three skeletal muscle fibers to generate 70 twitches, 70 contractions over the course of 1 minute, then you need the alpha motor neuron that synapses with them to pass them 70 action potentials over the course of that 1 minute, so that the skeletal muscle fibers will contract 70 times, right? Because each action potential that the skeletal muscle fiber is passed and generates translates into one twitch or one contraction. All right, now if we go over to the heart, okay, cardiac muscle fibers have no alpha motor neuron that synapses with them. That doesn't exist. There's no alpha motor neuron that travels out to skeletal muscle fibers and synapses with them and passes them action potentials and causes them to contract. Cardiac muscle fibers, a specific group of them, as you're about to see, actually have the ability to generate their own action potentials, which makes cardiac muscle fibers very, very unique compared to skeletal muscle fibers. Cardiac muscle fibers, again, there's a specific group of cardiac muscle fibers that we collectively call the SA or sinoatrial node, as we're going to talk about very shortly. Cardiac muscle fibers actually have the ability to generate their own action potentials without having an action potential passed to them, right? So if you want cardiac muscle fibers to generate 70 action potentials, and let's say you want the cardiac muscle fibers to contract or produce a twitch 70 times over the course of a minute, the cardiac muscle fibers themselves can actually generate their own action potentials 70 times over the course of a minute, and thus contract 70 times over the course of a minute. They don't actually need action potentials passed to them, which makes them entirely different than skeletal muscle fibers. Anytime you want a skeletal muscle fiber to contract within a given skeletal muscle, you need to pass an action potential to that skeletal muscle fiber from an alpha motor neuron. That's not the case with cardiac muscle fibers. There's a specific group of cardiac muscle fibers that can just generate their own action potentials. And they don't have to have action potentials passed to them. And thus, by generating their own action potentials, they signal themselves to actually contract. So that's the first huge difference between cardiac muscle fibers and skeletal muscle fibers. So the second big difference between cardiac muscle fibers and skeletal muscle fibers is this. Skeletal muscle fibers are all independent of each other. Okay, they're all separated from each other by the endomysium, and they're not actually directly attached to one another, really in any meaningful way. What I mean by that is, let's say that there is, let's add in another, 6 or 10 muscle fibers here. Okay, if This alpha motor neuron passes an action potential to these three muscle fibers, and these three muscle fibers generate an action potential, and those three muscle fibers then contract, generate a twitch. Those three skeletal muscle fibers are going to be the only three skeletal muscle fibers that actually contract. These other skeletal muscle fibers that I've drawn next to it, they're not going to contract at all because they haven't had an action potential passed to them. We went through all of this with the size principle. This should make perfect sense, I hope. The only muscle fibers within a whole skeletal muscle that are going to contract are the skeletal muscle fibers that have an action potential passed to them. Like if you pass an action potential to 10,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle, those are the only 10,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle that will actually contract. The other multiple 100,000 muscle fibers within the biceps muscle won't contract at all. Okay, that's a fundamental fact to skeletal muscle. The only muscle fibers within a skeletal muscle that will contract are the ones that have had action potentials passed to them, not any of the other skeletal muscle fibers within the whole muscle. That's completely not true for cardiac muscle fibers. When one cardiac muscle fiber generates an action potential and contracts, all of the cardiac muscle fibers throughout the heart will contract, right? That is also fundamentally important to cardiac muscle, as you're going to see. If one cardiac muscle fiber generates an action potential and contracts, they all do. The hundreds of thousands of cardiac muscle fibers throughout the heart will all contract if one does, okay? Because they're actually all connected to each other through these things called gap junctions. It's technically intercalated discs, but the gap junctions are the most important part. We're going to get to all of that, okay? All of the cardiac muscle fibers are attached to each other physically. And thus, if one generates an action potential and contracts, then all of the cardiac muscle fibers throughout the heart will do the same. Okay, so that's the second huge thing to realize about cardiac muscle compared to skeletal muscle fibers. So to summarize the two major differences, skeletal muscle fibers, if you want them to generate an action potential and thus contract, then an alpha motor neuron needs to pass them an action potential, and that will cause them to contract. Cardiac muscle fibers do not need an action potential passed to them to generate an action potential and contract. They can do it on their own. Cardiac muscle fibers have the ability, certain groups of them, have the ability to generate their own action potentials and thus stimulate their own contractions. Second, if you get three skeletal muscle fibers to contract, those are the only three skeletal muscle fibers within the whole muscle that will contract. None of the other ones will because skeletal muscle fibers are not attached to each other. Not true for cardiac muscle. Within the heart, if one cardiac muscle fiber generates an action potential and contracts, they all will throughout the heart. So now our job is to try to understand those two concepts about cardiac versus skeletal muscle fibers in much more detail. And we're going to take it one step at a time, and we're going to start off discussing how some cardiac muscle fibers have the ability to generate their own action potentials and thus contract on their own without having an action potential passed to them. What we call this is autorhythmicity. There are cardiac muscle fibers that are called autorhythmic. Oftentimes these are called pacemaker cells. If a collection of cardiac muscle fibers is autorhythmic, what that means is it automatically generates its own rhythm, let's say, of action potentials, and thus its own rhythm of contractions. Autorhythmic cells, you don't want to overthink it. Like autorhythmic cells just implies really that it's a cell that has its own ability to generate its own action potentials and thus, stimulate its own contractions. That's really what autorhythmic means. And what we need to do now is talk about these autorhythmic cells, cardiac muscle fibers as they are, of the heart. The most common autorhythmic cells of the heart, right? These are these cardiac muscle fibers that can generate their own action potentials and contract thus on their own without being stimulated by a neuron. Are often again called pacemaker cells. Now there are other autorhythmic cells, namely the conduction fibers, but that's going to come up in conversation much later on. Okay, we're going to focus on this first set of autorhythmic cardiac muscle fibers that are called pacemaker cells. Yet again, let's not get confused with all the different terminology. What we're doing here is we want to look at specific cardiac muscle fibers in the heart that can generate their own action potentials, and we want to try to understand how they can generate their own action potentials. Okay, so the collection of cardiac muscle fibers in the heart, the first one that we're going to discuss, that can generate their own action potentials and thus contract on their own without being stimulated by a neuron, is what's called the SA node, the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node is located in the upper right part of the right atrium. The SA node are actual cardiac muscle fibers that are actually part of the right atrium. They're located in the kind of upper right part of the right atrium itself. Okay, and these are cardiac muscle fibers that are autorhythmic. They actually have the ability to generate their own action potentials and ultimately contract on their own. So what we want to do is we really want to focus in on these cardiac muscle fibers. And the first thing that really throws people off is that when you see them highlighted in textbooks, they look incredibly mysterious, right? In yellow here is the sinoatrial node itself. And it looks like it's this special, like, it doesn't look like it should be a collection of cardiac muscle fibers, right? It looks like it's like a neuron or some specialized tissue, but it's not at all. I really dislike the way that textbooks tend to display the sinoatrial node. They oftentimes make it look like it's a different collection of cells in the heart than all the other ones. And if you were to look at the sinoatrial node, right, underneath a microscope, you would be able to tell absolutely no difference. If someone had an untrained eye, they would be able to tell absolutely no difference between the sinoatrial node and all the other cardiac muscle fibers in the heart. They would look exactly the same. This really shouldn't look, the sinoatrial node really shouldn't look any different than the other cardiac muscle fibers in the heart. But what textbooks do is they try to highlight it and show where it is, but I think it creates a lot of confusion. And I'm going to show you in the next image another picture of the sinoatrial node, and it kind of does the same thing. It makes it look like it's this collection of special cells or tissue, when in reality, structurally, it doesn't look any different than the other cardiac fibers. So here you go. It's showing you in this image a highlighted depiction of the sinoatrial node. This is the sinoatrial node. It's a collection of cardiac muscle fibers that exists in the upper right atrium. Okay. And if you were to look at this image, you would say, well, the sinoatrial node is this big purple dot, right? It's like this, must be this really unique structure that exists within the heart. And that's not how this should look. Okay, what the sinoatrial node should actually look like is it would look underneath a microscope, it would look just like these other cardiac muscle fibers. This is an image of cardiac muscle fibers. Okay, these are all cardiac muscle fibers. And the sinoatrial node is a collection of cardiac muscle fibers that looks just like these other cardiac muscle fibers. Okay? If you look at this underneath a microscope, right, in histology, you can tell a slight difference. But again, somebody that was just taking, like, say, their first or second histology course, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference unless they just were told to memorize, some specific little thing about it. SA node muscle fibers, cardiac muscle fibers, look just like all the other cardiac muscle fibers in the heart. Okay. Why they decided to do this in purple and as a big blob, I don't know. Every textbook does this. And it just creates enormous amounts of confusion. You have to imagine that the SA node is just a collection of cardiac muscle fibers, like I've tried to draw here, that look just like these cardiac muscle fibers. All that should be done in reality is the textbook should show a collection of cardiac muscle fibers and then just, draw a circle around them or something and say, well, there you have it. These are the SA node fibers. And maybe they could draw them structurally a little bit different because the SA node fibers do have a little bit less actin and myosin than the regular cardiac muscle fibers do. But generally, the SA node fibers look exactly the same compared to the other cardiac muscle fibers. Okay, so that's what I want you to try to imagine in your head and remember throughout this is don't think of the SA node, this collection of cardiac muscle fibers that has the ability to generate their own action potentials. Don't think of these cardiac muscle fibers as looking any different than the other cardiac muscle fibers in the heart, because they don't. Now, that's not to say that the SA node isn't very, very important. It's incredibly important. Without the SA node, you'd be dead. Okay? It's very important to understand what it is, what it does. Okay? It's just also important to realize structurally it doesn't look any different than the rest of the heart. Okay? So here we have it. We're drawing the SA node, which is a collection of cardiac muscle fibers. And what makes the SA node, and we can say SA node cardiac muscle fibers, special is their ability to generate their own action potentials and then thus contract on their own without a stimulus. So what we need to do now is we need to focus in on an SA node fiber, right? A cardiac muscle fiber that's within the SA node, or part of the SA node, and we need to look at how it's possible for the SA node fiber to generate its own action potentials and what that ultimately means for the heart. So here I'm going to draw you an SA node fiber. Okay? It's one of the cardiac muscle fibers that makes up the SA node. Okay? The first thing about SA node fibers, again, we're trying to figure out how they generate their own action potentials. The first thing about the SA node fibers is they don't have resting membrane potentials. You can't call, they have membrane potentials, but you can't call them resting membrane potentials because their membrane potentials don't rest. If you take a probe and you stick it in to the SA node, the membrane potential is always changing. It never stays the same. If you take a probe and you stick it into a skeletal muscle fiber, or you stick it into a neuron, the skeletal muscle fiber will rest at negative 90 millivolts. The neuron will rest at negative 70 millivolts, right? It'll just stay there until the skeletal muscle fiber or the neuron is stimulated to generate an action potential. That's not true for SA node fibers. If you stick a probe into the SA node, these SA node fibers, these autorhythmic cardiac muscle fibers, SA node fibers, their membrane potential is always fluctuating, right? It'll be negative 60 1 second, and then the next second it'll be positive 20. And then it'll be, changing again back down towards negative 60, and then it'll be positive 20. It's just always changing. And ultimately what that means is the SA node fibers are always they're continuously generating their own action potentials. It never stops. So what we want to understand is why the SA node doesn't have a resting membrane potential. It can't have a resting membrane potential. It needs to always be fluctuating if it's always generating its own action potential. So that's what we're going to start with. You can't say that the SA node fibers have a resting membrane potential, because they don't. But they do have what we could say is a kind of peak negative potential, and that is around negative 70 millivolts. On average, if you were to, probe an SA node fiber and you were to look at its membrane potential, it wouldn't have a resting membrane potential, but the most negative that it would get in kind of a resting circumstance, meaning that the person isn't exercising or they're not sedated or something, you would see that the most negative that the fibers would get would be around -60. And then once it hit -60, it would begin to depolarize. It would begin to become more positive. It wouldn't truly rest at -60 millivolts. It would just start changing right again, once you hit -60. So we can't call it a resting membrane potential. But the question is, what's causing the SA node fibers to begin depolarizing, become more positive at -60? First of all, SA node fibers have all of the same sort of potassium and sodium leak channels that neurons and skeletal muscle fibers do. So all those leak channels are there. Okay. So theoretically, like, you could actually get a SA node fiber to establish a resting membrane potential if it weren't for these things called funny channels. Okay, so let's explain. I'm getting too far ahead of myself. You measure the SA node fiber, and it's at -60 millivolts. Here's what happens around -60 millivolts. There are these things, these channels, that are called funny channels. Okay. Funny channels are actually a type of sodium channel. They're essentially a type of kind of voltage-gated sodium channel. And what these funny channels, which again are really a sodium channel, what they do is they actually begin to open as the interior becomes more negative. As the interior of the SA node fiber becomes more and more negative, that actually causes the funny channels, these voltage-gated sodium channels, to open. And that's actually why they get their name, funny channel. Because what do we know about most sodium channels? What do we know about most voltage-gated sodium channels? Don't almost all of them open up when the interior of a cell depolarizes? Think about a neuron in like the axon hillock. Think about a skeletal muscle fiber next to the motor end plate. The way that you get voltage-gated sodium channels typically to open is you depolarize the neuron, or you depolarize the skeletal muscle fiber. And then that causes the voltage-gated sodium channels to open. That's not what happens in these SA node fibers. These SA node fibers have these voltage-gated sodium channels, which we call funny channels, that actually open up as the interior becomes more negative. We don't really know of other sodium channels that do this, and that's why they're called funny, because their gating properties are so funny. The gates actually begin to open up on these voltage-gated sodium channels as the interior of the cell becomes more negative. So think about what this is going to mean. As the SA node fiber is becoming more negative, right, towards -60, these funny channels, which are often called F-type, that just stands for funny, F-type or funny channels, they actually begin to open. More and more and more of them will begin to open as the interior becomes more and more negative. And what does that mean? What do we know about sodium? Sodium is high outside of cardiac muscle fibers, and it's low inside. Okay? No difference here, for SA node fibers compared to neurons and skeletal muscle fibers. None of that changes. There's not too many cells in the body where this is reversed. Sodium is high outside and sodium is low inside. Okay? Also, what's the interior potential? It's -60 millivolts. So if we start opening up a whole bunch of F-type funny channels, right, as the interior becomes more and more negative, what's happening to the SA node fiber? It's becoming more and more permeable to sodium. So what's going to happen? Sodium's going to start to come in through both its chemical and its electrical driving force, right? Sodium is high outside, low inside, so it has a chemical driving force to come in. It's -60 on the interior, so it has an electrical driving force to come in. There's not many sodium leak channels in the membrane, just like every other cell that we've been discussing. So if you start opening up a whole bunch of funny channels, then what's going to happen is sodium is going to start rushing in to the SA node fiber. And what's that going to do? If you get an influx of sodium ions, which is a positive ion, it's going to start depolarizing, making the interior more positive. So this influx of sodium through the F-type channels or the funny channels begins to depolarize the SA node fibers. All right, this is one of the few times where I'm going to simplify a little bit compared to what your textbook does. Your textbook doesn't just talk about F-type funny channels, it also talks about these transient type calcium channels, which are a little bit too theoretical for me, and not everybody's 100% sure exactly how those channels are involved right now. So it also adds a level of complexity to this that would require me to go on for another 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and it's just not necessary. So I am going to bypass very slightly what your textbook does, but it doesn't change the fundamental conversation whatsoever. Okay, so as the interior reaches negative 70 millivolts, more and more of these voltage-gated sodium channels called F-type channels, funny channels, begin to open. They're funny because they're a voltage-gated sodium channel that opens up as the interior becomes more negative rather than more positive. Okay, so they begin to open up, more and more of them, and basically the SA node fibers' permeability to sodium is increasing. So sodium comes in through its chemical and its electrical driving force and begins to depolarize the SA node fiber, and it begins to become more positive. And what we're going to say is the funny channels stay open until the interior reaches about negative 50 millivolts. You'll see that your textbook would disagree with that to some degree, and the textbook's probably partly right, but there are certain things that we just don't know about these SA node fibers to this day. There's a lot of disagreements around them. So this is one of the circumstances where don't rely on your textbook. Just rely on what I'm. It's still good to read it, but you'll see that it differs a little bit from what I'm saying. So we're going to say that the F-type channels, the funny channels, stay open until the interior reaches around negative 50 millivolts, meaning you're getting this big influx of sodium ions into the SA node fiber, depolarizing it to negative 50, and then the funny channels close. But the great thing about this is what's happened is the SA node fiber has been depolarized to threshold. There's another type of channel. Let's draw it in a different color. Here. That is called a voltage-gated calcium channel. It's actually referred to as L-type, which stands for long. They stay open for a long period of time, which will become relevant later on in the conversation. But if you can get the interior of the SA node fiber from negative 60 to negative 50, then what will happen is the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels will open. And what do we know about calcium? Calcium is high outside. Calcium is low inside. So it has a chemical driving force to enter. The interior is negative 50. Calcium is a positively charged ion, so it also has an electrical driving force to enter. So what's going to happen? You're going to get a big influx of calcium ions through these voltage-gated calcium channels, these L-type calcium channels. And that's ultimately going to depolarize the SA node fiber all the way up to like positive 10 or positive 20, right? It's going to make it real positive on the interior. This is hitting threshold. What the F-type funny channels do is they allow enough sodium to come in to cause the SA node fiber to hit threshold. At threshold, this is like, in the hillock where all the voltage-gated sodium channels open up. In the case of the SA node, when you get to threshold of negative 50, that's actually when voltage-gated calcium channels open up. This is the first type of cell that I've shown you where threshold translates into the opening of voltage-gated calcium channels rather than voltage-gated sodium channels. And this also it all has a relevance, but you're going to have to wait a little bit for me to explain it. Anyways, what is going to line the entire length of the SA node fiber? And the answer is more voltage-gated calcium channels. L-type voltage-gated calcium channels. And over here, what's the membrane potential? Right? The membrane potential over here is going to still be more negative. Okay, it might be still negative 60, negative 60, negative 60, we'll say it's not going to be exactly negative 60, but in these adjacent regions, it's definitely going to be more negative. That's the overarching point that I'm trying to make here. So where are all these calcium ions going to go? Where's this wave of positivity going to head? Right? This wave of positivity, it's positive 10 in this region right here because of this big influx of calcium ions. The calcium ions are going to flow into the subsequently negative region. Right? The wave of positivity is going to head towards an area of negativity. It's going to depolarize that region. And what's going to happen? More voltage-gated calcium channels are going to open up. More L-type channels are going to open up. And then what happens? More calcium is going to shoot in and is going to drive the interior up to, let's again say, positive 10. Right? And then what's going to happen? This wave of positivity, these calcium ions are going to head from this region into the next subsequently negative region. Right? The wave of positivity, the calcium ions are going to move into the adjacent region where it's still more negative. It's going to make that region more positive. It's going to depolarize it, and then more voltage-gated calcium channels are going to open, L-type channels. Calcium is going to shoot in. Calcium is then going to drive this region up to positive 10. What are you witnessing here? You're witnessing propagation of the action potential. The SA node fiber got to threshold on its own. Right? It didn't need a neurotransmitter to be able to get to threshold. Let's redraw this and talk about it a little bit more. So up here we'll say is a skeletal muscle fiber, and down here is an SA node fiber. Okay. Skeletal muscle fibers can't generate their own action potentials. They have to have an action potential passed to them. How does that happen? Well, they have these acetylcholine receptors, right, called nicotinic cholinergic receptors, ligand-gated channels, a million different terms, right? These acetylcholine receptors, which are really sodium channels. If ACH gets released onto the skeletal muscle fiber, then ACH will bind to these nicotinic cholinergic receptors, these sodium channels, cause them to open up. Sodium will shoot into the skeletal muscle fiber, depolarize it. That wave of positivity will head to the subsequent region next to the motor end plate. And if you depolarize that region, then the voltage-gated sodium channels will open up, and an action potential will start propagating down the skeletal muscle fiber, right? So the skeletal muscle fiber has to have an action potential passed to it by an alpha motor neuron, and it does that by releasing acetylcholine onto the skeletal muscle fiber. Okay, the SA node fiber doesn't have any of that, right? The skeletal muscle fiber does not generate its own action potential. It has to actually have an action potential passed to it by an alpha motor neuron, and it passes it using acetylcholine. The SA node fiber can generate its own action potential because at negative 60 millivolts, what happens is the F-type channels, the funny channels, begin to just naturally open up. Right? The funny channels are called funny because as the interior becomes more negative, they're a voltage-gated sodium channel that actually just begins to open as the interior becomes more negative. And as more F-type channels open up due to the interior of the SA node fiber becoming more negative, that ultimately allows for sodium to shoot in and depolarize the SA node fiber to threshold of negative 50 millivolts. And then once you get to threshold, the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels open up, calcium shoots in, and an action potential has begun, right? An action potential is now going to begin propagating down this SA node fiber using voltage-gated calcium channels, L-type calcium channels. So this is what we mean when we say that the SA node fibers can generate their own action potentials. They can generate their own action potentials thanks to the funny channels, which open up as the interior becomes more negative, and that allows calcium in, which depolarizes the SA node fibers to threshold. The second big thing about the SA node fibers compared to the skeletal muscle fibers, the SA node fibers, and you're going to see that this is true for other autorhythmic pacemaker cells of ultimately the heart, is that the SA node fibers actually propagate their action potentials utilizing calcium. Right? As the action potential propagates, it's due to a continual influx of calcium down the length of the SA node fiber. In a skeletal muscle fiber, the action potential propagates with sodium. right? So there's another huge difference, and this will become relevant. It's just, we're just not quite there yet. But we've got to finish this off, right? Because the SA node fiber, all I've shown you so far is that the SA node fiber generates its own action potential because the F-type channels, the funny channels, open up as the interior becomes more negative. These are the F-type. That allows sodium in, which depolarizes the SA node fiber to threshold of -50. Then the L-type channels, voltage-gated calcium channels, open up. Calcium shoots in. A big influx of calcium drives the interior up to +10. Then the waves of positivity start heading towards the subsequently negative regions and opening up more voltage-gated calcium L-type channels. And the action potential propagates with calcium, right? This area is now depolarized to +10. Over here, it's still somewhere around -60. There are voltage-gated L-type channels over here, and if this wave of positivity, these calcium ions head into the next region, it'll depolarize that region. More voltage-gated calcium channels open up. Okay? Propagation of the action potential down the SA node fiber. But what we still haven't solved here is how does the SA node fiber repolarize? How does the interior get back from +10 back towards -60 so the process can start over again? All right, so when we got to -60, the F-type channels, the funny channels, they opened up, sodium shot in, drove the interior up to -50 or threshold. But at that point, the F-type channels closed. Right? They closed at -50, but that doesn't matter because they got the SA node fiber to threshold where the L-type channels, the voltage-gated calcium channels, opened up. And now this is where, if the stuff about repolarizing with neurons made sense to you, this is going to be so much easier. If when you actually get the SA node fiber to threshold of -50, what opens up on the L-type channels, those voltage-gated calcium channels, is their activation gates. This is going to be exactly what you've seen in the past. Their activation gates are what open at -50. When the SA node fiber hits threshold, the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels activation gates open, and what that does is that's actually what allows calcium to shoot in and drive the interior up to +10. And then you might think, what happens at +10? Okay, let's erase all of this. At +10, what closes, of course, are the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels. And more specifically, what closes on them are their inactivation gates. Right? Their inactivation gates shut. Okay? And that means no more calcium can come in, right? Calcium is shut out of the cell. And at the same time, what do you think happens? How about we draw it in purple? Voltage-gated potassium channels open up, right? At +10 approximately, the voltage-gated potassium channels open up. And where does potassium want to go? Potassium's high inside, potassium is low outside. The interior is +10, so we can assume that the outside is somewhat negative. So potassium has both a chemical driving force to leave and an electrical driving force to leave. And if the voltage-gated potassium channels open, then you better believe potassium is going to shoot out. And as potassium shoots out, what's the interior losing? The interior is losing positively charged potassium ions, which means the number of negatively charged ions on the inside is proportionally rising. So thanks to the voltage-gated potassium channels opening, at +10, potassium shoots out through its chemical and electrical driving force, and it begins to repolarize the SA node fiber, right? It begins to make the interior more negative because as more and more positively charged potassium ions leave, the interior is going to become more and more negative, and it's going to go back down towards -60, although we're not there yet. What's going to happen at -50? Well, -50 is technically threshold for the voltage-gated calcium channels, the L-type channels. So shouldn't the voltage-gated calcium channels, the L-type channels, open up when we repolarize to -50? And the answer is no, of course not, because their inactivation gates are closed. Their inactivation gates aren't going to open up under a voltage. So you can get beyond -50 back down towards -60. And somewhere between -50 and -60, what do you think happens? The voltage-gated calcium channels, which I highlighted in blue, I should probably just redraw this at this point, but the voltage, I'll just go ahead and redraw it. So two things are going to happen inside of the SA node fiber when you get to +10. When the interior depolarizes to +10, two things are going to happen. These are the voltage-gated calcium channels, the L-type channels. When you get to +10, the L-type channels are going to close because their inactivation gates shut, right? And their activation gates would still be open. Okay, but their inactivation gates close, and that prevents any more calcium from being able to come in. Okay, so at +10, the voltage-gated calcium channel inactivation gates shut simultaneously. I didn't mean to do that in red. Simultaneously, the voltage-gated potassium channels open up at +10. And potassium then shoots out through its chemical and its electrical driving force to start. That repolarizes the SA node fiber, right? It begins to become more negative, and it starts heading back down towards -60. As more and more potassium leaves, the interior becomes more and more negative. And the question is, why, when you get back to -50, don't those L-type voltage-gated calcium channels open again at -50? That's their threshold. And the answer is because these inactivation gates are shut. They don't open up at -50. So potassium can keep leaving and keep repolarizing the SA node fiber closer and closer to -60. But something's got to happen between -50 and -60. Right? Somewhere between -50 and -50, right? Somewhere between -50 and -60, right? We're repolarizing, so we're becoming more and more negative. Somewhere between -50 and -60, the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels are going to reset. What does that mean? It means, let's see how well I can do this. It means that their inactivation gates pop back open and their activation gates shut. Between -50 and -60, the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels reset. Their inactivation gates pop back open and their activation gates close. And that means if you can get back to threshold of -50, the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels will open again. So let's keep going. As we approach let's change the color. As we approach -60, because we are still repolarizing here, right? Because potassium's leaving. As we approach -60, two things are going to happen. The voltage-gated potassium channels are going to begin to close. Okay? They're going to begin to shut again. So as we get closer and closer to -60, the voltage-gated potassium channels shut. And what also is going to happen? Let's draw these, how about in green? No, green doesn't work. How about yellow? At around -60, hopefully you know the answer to this. The F-type voltage-gated sodium channels are going to begin to open, right? Because they open up as the interior becomes more and more negative. So as the interior approaches -60, two things are going to happen. And this is why the SA node fiber's membrane potential never rests at anything. Because as the interior becomes more negative, the voltage-gated potassium channels close. So potassium, let's do a different color. So potassium can't leave anymore through the voltage-gated potassium channels. And at the same time, these F-type voltage-gated sodium channels open up. the F-type funny channels, voltage-gated sodium channels, begin to open as the interior becomes more and more negative. So two things happen around -60. The voltage-gated potassium channels close, so less potassium is now leaving. And at the same time, the F-type funny channels begin to open up because the interior is becoming more negative, and you're going to start getting a greater and greater influx of sodium ions, which is going to do what to the membrane potential? It's going to begin to depolarize it again. It's going to begin to rise from -60 back up towards -50 millivolts. And if you get back to -50 millivolts, what's going to happen? The L-type voltage-gated sodium channels activation gates are going to open up, and calcium is going to shoot in again, and you're going to get another action potential. The influx of the calcium ions through the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels will drive you back up to +10. And by the way, at -50, let's be clear, the F-type channels closed. Okay, so the F-type channels only stayed open long enough to get us to threshold of -50, and then the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels opened up again, big influx of calcium, and now the action potential is going to propagate down the SA node fiber once again. And I mean, you could do this 300 times, but what happens at +10? Right? At +10, now that you're back to +10, what happens? Well, the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels here are going to close. No more calcium can come in through them. So you're stuck at +10 at the same time. The voltage-gated potassium channels open up at +10. Potassium shoots out, begins to drive the interior back down towards -60. Right? It repolarizes it. And the reason that the voltage-gated calcium channels, these L-type channels, don't open up again at -50 is because their inactivation gates are shut. So you can continue to repolarize towards -60. Somewhere between -50 and -60, the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels will reset, meaning they're, have to be real careful there. I'll erase the whole thing. Meaning that their inactivation gates swing back open and their activation gates shut. So if you can get back to threshold, they'll open up. That happens somewhere between -50 and -60. At the same time, as you approach -60, more and more of the voltage-gated potassium channels will close. And at the same time, the F-type, let's do that in a different color. The F-type voltage-gated sodium channels will begin to open. So around -60, the voltage-gated potassium channels shut, less potassium can leave. The F-type channels, funny channels, open up, more sodium can come in, and the interior begins to depolarize again. And it depolarizes up from -60 to -50, and then what do you know? The L-type voltage-gated calcium channels open again, and you get this big influx of calcium ions again, and you get an action potential. Okay, this process just keeps repeating itself over and over and over and over and over again. These SA node fibers will do this repetitively at rest about 70 times per minute, and they'll do that for your entire life. Right? These SA node fibers, these sinylateral node fibers, these autorhythmic cells, pacemaker cells, whatever you want to call them, they will generate about 70 of these action potentials per minute for an entire lifetime. Put your hand on your heart and count how many times it contracts over the course of a minute. It'll be about 70. Varies a lot from one person to the next, but the average is about 70. The reason that it's contracting is actually thanks to these SA node fibers generating action potentials. Obviously, we still have a lot to explain as to how these SA node fibers generating action potentials translates into the entire heart contracting, but hopefully the first part of this makes sense. Here again, you can see the SA node in purple. Why it's in purple, I'll never know. But the SA node is in purple. And all it is it's a collection of cardiac muscle fibers, just like these cardiac muscle fibers, that these cardiac muscle fibers are only different in the SA node because they have the ability to generate their own action potentials to the process that we just went through. These cardiac muscle fibers that make up the SA node generate about 70 action potentials per minute. Okay? Every one of them. And what we have to do from this point on in the next lectures is explain how these SA node fibers generating 70 action potentials per minute translates into the entire heart contracting 70 times per minute. Because logically, just because there's a collection of cardiac muscle fibers in the upper right atrium that can generate their own action potentials, that doesn't really explain how the whole heart can contract 70 times per minute. Like, how does the SA node fibers generating their own action potentials translate into an entire heart contraction? And the first thing that I can tell you before we get to the next lecture is that you should notice that the SA node fibers are attached to the other true contractile cardiac fibers of the right atrium, right? They're physically attached to them. So perhaps these SA node fibers that just generated their own action potentials have the ability to pass those action potentials to the other cardiac muscle fibers of the right atrium that they're attached to. And maybe those action potentials cause those atrial muscle fibers to contract. Who knows? That is the next part of the conversation. And by the way, we'll go through the whole process of excitation, contraction, coupling, how the action potential causes cardiac muscle fibers to contract as well. But the SA node fibers themselves don't actually have a lot of actin and myosin within them. So the SA node fibers do contract a little bit through the same way that these other cardiac muscle fibers are going to contract, but at the same time, it's not really the same thing. So we'll get to the actual contraction part of how an action potential causes a cardiac muscle fiber to contract once we discuss how these fibers generate their own action. And they don't generate their own action potentials, but how these cardiac muscle fibers generate action potentials and how that causes them to contract. It'll all come together.